I think we're ready to go here. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Concordia University's Fourth Space. Thank you for joining us for today's presentation of the collective project by the Textiles and Materiality Research Cluster, ChainStitch. To help situate you, we are streaming to YouTube live from Fourth Space, which is located on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. At Fourth Space, we work with our university community to mobilize knowledge by co-creating daily activities to examine research questions and projects in development here at the university. We are running this event as a live stream meeting, so we welcome your comments and questions with a raised hand or via the chat. With that, it is now my pleasure to hand it over to Morris Fox.
Okay, am I unmuted? Okay, so hi, everyone. I'm Morris, coordinator for Textile and Materialities at Amelia Institute. I think my makes second. That's fine. We can pass it back and forth. Is it a go? Okay. Hi, thank you. So yeah, as I was saying, I'm the research coordinator for the Textile and Materiality Cluster at the Amelia Institute of Arts, Culture, and Technology. So for our project related to the Commons exhibition, we're really thinking about common cloth, what makes community, especially communities of makers and fibers artists and researchers. So when we were kind of envisioning the project, we were thinking about how, within the larger use of materials that surround us in our material world and culture, plastics has really taken over, as well as other environmentally hazardous materials and industrial processes. So we were trying to think, within our own researches, what are ways that we can make more sustainable practices, and how can we come together and collaborate on some of those processes through textiles. So our project ChainStitch is kind of envisioned as a botanical garden, or like the metaphorically as a botanical garden or a physics garden, which is a kind of garden specifically through which medicinal plants used to be grown, also called a pharmacopoeia. Through this, we kind of use three types of processes which to dye all the cloths. So those were using the speculative life biolab's ability to grow cultures of bacteria, specifically Serratia marcescens, which is what produce the kind of purple dye techniques that you'll see in some of the cloths. We then also concurrently ran workshops and skill shared rust dyeing workshops. So that was under the direction of MASH Lab, which is the Matter and Sustainable Hybridity Lab run by Dr. Miranda Smitheram. So the rust dye is kind of symbolic of one, how much discarded produce or things are discarded in our culture. And kind of we were speculating, as in kind of thinking through as an imagination, what we can do with those kind of discarded materials. So rust is kind of fascinating. It's within our bloodstream. So you think about red blood cells, they've been oxidized, and that's why they're red. So there's an interaction between the rust outside and then perhaps the rust inside us, thinking through processes of decay as also creative processes. So a whole bunch of us kind of went wild within that process to produce the rust dyes. And we also experimented with vinegar and also tea. So tea has a lot of tannins in it, and tannins produce kind of some of the darker colors on the orange squares. And then the third process was to integrate solar dyeing through using botanical material that has been kind of sourced ethically or scavenged around Montreal to get. After which we also applied kind of the machine hand as well. So using a Tajima embroidery machine, which can stitch kind of thousands of individual stitches a second, and thinking through our relationships with machine beings and ourselves as we live in a very mediated current era, but thinking of those as productive collaborations, and also in the same way as we were thinking with our collaborations with bacteria, rust, and other processes. So this is the final result of the project, which happened over the course of August and into September. So it was over the course of 4 or 5 work sessions. And I think kind of framing it, we were really thinking about our current site of ecological loss brought on by our climate change and ways to rethink what textiles and fiber processes do, given that on an industrial scale, they're one of the largest industrial polluters on the earth. So I have here with me one of our contributors, Marie-Claire Gillet, and I'm going to pass the mic over to her to talk a bit about your participation.
Is the mic on? Yes, perfect. Okay. I'll introduce myself. I'm Marie-Claire Gillet, and I am the current scholar in residence in interdisciplinary studies and practices in the fine arts, in the Faculty of Fine Arts. And I'm also a member of the Textiles and Materiality cluster and got to participate in this project. So thank you, Morris. It was really something. I participated in the rust dyeing workshop with Miranda Smitheram in the MASH lab, and also in the Tajima embroidery process. And I guess, would you like me to just talk about my experience of?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, okay. Well, I can say that I had no idea that rust dyeing was possible intentionally, although it's something that I had seen happen unintentionally quite often when like pieces of cloth are beside something metal and then you unwrap them and realize that there's a mark on them. That's something that I had always seen, but didn't realize that it was a process that people were using to intentionally mark make on cloth. And so it was totally new to me, but I found myself really caught up in the sort of childish joyfulness of how we were all experimenting with this technique and this method and these materials, because it kind of felt like most of the people in that room were really at the beginning of their relationship with rust as a material with which to dye. And there was definitely a sense of collaboration in the space, but a sense of really like joyful and curious collaboration. And I think that oftentimes in the context of post-secondary education and in the context of kind of these lab spaces, at least in my experience, I'm not necessarily used to that kind of curious joy, and hearing somebody say from across the room, oh, I'm going to try this, like I'm going to put the nails this way in the cloth. So I thought it was really interesting the way that introducing, and I'm not sure if this was an intention of the project, but introducing these methods and techniques and materials that perhaps a lot of the people that were participating had never really engaged with before, kind of opened us up to collaborate in a different way than if, for example, you had said, let's all do needlework together. That's something that a lot of people in the cluster are familiar with, or let's all knit together, or, do some weaving on small looms. These are materials and techniques and practices that most people are pretty comfortable with. And so I think that the way that the project introduced us to something new kind of opened up a different type of collaboration and sense of like collaborative knowledge sharing and exploration that I don't experience that often. So that was really something. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. No, I think we were really thinking through involving, because along with the cluster spaces, which are dedicated research clusters focused on very specific types of research, there's also these really wonderful laboratory spaces at Milia, which we don't necessarily think, oh, like my textile knowledge is applicable to doing work with bacteria, for example. So I think it was an opportunity to engage across labs and to also, as you were saying, like a fun experimental approach to introducing certain types of processes perhaps into our work or our research. I had never thought to dye with bacteria, for example, and I know you weren't here for that workshop, you were in the Rust workshop, but I found even there, I was like, I know the method that we're using to fold and create patterns on the cloths, which were kind of inspired by shibori techniques or kind of what I colloquially think of as tie-dyeing. And then knowing that instead of us dipping the cloths into the different dye baths and doing that process, instead, we got to see the actual bacteria grow and turn the cloths pink, which was a really kind of special moment of thinking, this is another type of life that exists on this planet, which traditionally is thought of as a pathogen, as not wanted, as something that we want to sanitize. So rethinking our relationships with that material, and then also rust, which is again a unwanted and yet prevalent type of mineral life on this planet. It's really an opportunity to think, okay, how can I switch my own thinking into these other modes of working with materials, and also processes that, like you were saying, like I hadn't worked with before. So rust dyeing, I was really excited about it because I follow different Instagrams which do rust dyeing, and the effects are kind of within my own imagination and research practices, which are kind of about ruins and the Gothic and the end of nature and all of these kind of more morbid subject matters, being able to rethink them as sites of fun or ludic activity or practices which are playful, was actually really important to then thinking about climate grief, for example, or the stress of being in an institution, which I think we also have all been feeling this September, at least as we get back and acclimated to the environment of academic studies. So yeah.
But also I think that idea of being like curious and engaged with cloth, and it's something that I often hear in relation to constructing garments and mending garments, this idea that if somebody's invested in the process of making the garment and they know how it was made and they know what kind of labor went into it, they'll be more likely to care for it, right? This is a narrative that we hear, and I think it's also true. If we mend our clothing, if we have a relationship with our clothing or with other textiles in our lives, then we're going to be more likely to value them and to not dump them in a landfill, not to buy really cheap versions of them. But something that we don't think about very often is where the color comes from, and being engaged in color of cloth and like the processes that make cloth look the way that it looks. And so for me, that was an interesting, again, this narrative of caring for cloth via stitching and making your own clothes and that making you value them is something that's familiar to me. But the idea of being engaged with where color comes from and engaged with the processes of coloring cloth, and that may be changing the way that we look at fashion and textiles. And I've been thinking a lot about like black dye being really toxic and how we were able to get some really dark blacks from rust, and thinking, oh, okay, is there potential for these kinds of methods being developed to get similar colors, but maybe also does engagement with these processes reorient us to think, okay, we're not actually looking for this color. What about this really dark brown? Could that be like the new black of cloth because those dyes are more toxic and this is a more sustainable way to get that kind of color? And so it was kind of a reorientation for me to open up my conception of engagement with textiles being linked to sustainability, and engagement with like the process of making clothes being linked to sustainability, opening that to include like color as well and dyeing as well, because it's something I hadn't really thought about, like which colors of clothing are sustainable for me to be buying. I'm not sure how this was dyed, but now I'm very conscious of it, No,
I agree with you. And I think, one of the things that we're often made unaware of by clothing industries is the kind of life cycle, from what the material is spun out of, all the way through the manufacture of the fabric to the finished garment, all the kind of global networks of travel, that the distance that those processes go through before it arrives and we then wear it. And I think, if you're already interested in things like mending or restitching, then you're kind of like, how do I maintain what I wear and what kind of forms in some ways parts of my identity in a longer timeline than my sock as a whole, and now it gets discarded. And I think dyeing processes can be part of that, but then a lot of home dyeing are still kind of using I think Rite Aid made it really accessible to customize your own clothing, but those are mostly synthetic dyes, which the water that gets used for that dyeing, which goes through multiple wash cycles, ends up being part of a toxic ecology rather than a sustained one. And so some of these processes at least suggest that there are other ways to do that, and that also because none of them are fully light fast, as in over time the colors might shift, they'll have their own life cycle of appearance, and how to work with that rather than that being a problem within its design, rather than synthetic dyeing processes, which are often, it's going to start by looking like this, and the hope is that it will forever look like that, right?
Yeah, and you bring up an interesting point as well, which I was thinking about in relation to two of the dye processes, this idea of what is toxicity and what does it look like for something to be toxic? Because you're talking about RIT dye, which is not something we think of as being dangerous, right? We think, oh, we're just going to put our clothes in the wash. What's left of the dye will go into the drainage system and I don't have to think about it anymore. But I was really struck by the conversations around the bacteria, and maybe you can talk a little bit more about that, and also the conversation around the rust. This idea of keep your gloves on because you don't want the rust to get on your skin, because we actually are not supposed to have that much iron in our systems, which was weirdly magical to me. This idea that I was working with this material that was attracted to my blood and my blood was attracted to it. And that's a different kind of way of thinking about danger and toxicity than thinking about RIT dye.
Yeah.
It feels more human scale and embodied and more present and immediate. We really have to think about this when we're working with these materials. It's not a question of what comes out of the washing machine later on, which is easy to ignore, even though of course we know it's not a problem, but can you talk a bit more about the bacteria and what
for sure.
people...
So this is paraphrasing also Alexandra Bachmeyer, who's the laboratory research assistant at the Speculative Life Biolab. So she did a really wonderful breakdown of kind of some of the history of the bacteria we were working with. So I'll just touch on it from my remembrance of that. But so this bacteria, Serratia marcescens, is in its kind of natural form around the world a pathogen. It's especially prevalent as a problem within hospitals and other actually sanitary areas, because it has a natural attraction to soap and to the fats which exist in soap. It at one point was, there was an idea that it would kill off other types of life that are unwanted. I don't know if it was mosquitoes or not. This is, again, not my knowledge, but basically at one point the US government was experimenting with it as, can this be used as a pesticide or insecticide? And they kind of sprayed it all over the place, causing a lot of illnesses within populations, especially I would say populations which face environmental racism, which is the proximity to toxins faced by certain marginalized communities, especially BIPOC communities. And I think that was oh my God, wow, that kind of history of a bacteria, it's now come into the lab through a genetically modified version of it. So it's already had involvement by the human hand to turn it into a non-pathogenic agent, so it can exist within what we're capable of handling within the lab as a biohazard 1 lab.
How many levels of biohazard are there?
Mark, do you know? Mark's in the audience. Four
Okay.
question mark, maybe
That's
five.
actually kind of high, maybe.
Yeah. So I think one is the lowest.
I know, but if there's only 4 levels.
True, but those can
Okay.
escalate high. Yeah, I think. But I think like to answer and maybe within my own research interest and everything, that idea of contamination or cross-contamination, I think especially in textiles is interesting to look at, because one, we've contaminated our environments with industrial petrochemical processes, especially if you think about polyester or a lot of the synthetic fibers that we produce. They're produced by oil. So it's part of the petrochemical industrial capitalist complex, to paraphrase horribly. So it's part of big oil. It's a huge problem, not only within the kind of new materials that are produced, but then the wear and tear in our washing machines release microplastics into our own waterways. And that's not to then speak of also how pollutants are, exist globally, and how we here in Canada, unequally share our responsibility of, a global catastrophe of plastics. So, and the life cycle of clothing. So I think I think about Mally Chen's book, Animacies, Biopolitics, and blanking on the rest of it, but she talks about kind of co-intoxication as a process that, if we recognize and celebrate the fact that we are co-intoxicated beings, that we simultaneously emit toxins and are intoxicated by substances, it's a kind of more rich way of looking at the world that we exist in, rather than this kind of separation between, no, I don't want any bacteria because germs are bad,
Which is not real.
Not real.
Possible.
So I think working with this bacteria, and we were in a lab with gloves on, practicing our protocols that we have to, but at the same time, it was a much more intimate way of working with bacteria as an artist or as a researcher, and being able to see kind of certain results form and see how that life cycle of the bacteria kind of went through its whole cycle of life. And then with the rust as well, I think with that idea that, we think about blood poisoning or tetanus, which is another term for it. And that's the risk of working with these materials. But does that mean that we shouldn't be working with these materials? Or should it just mean that we have to have kind of respect for, or kind of mutual engagement with it in a different way? Yeah.
I do have to say, I was thinking about tetanus as a person who grew up on a farm running around in bare feet and was always being told, put your shoes on, you're going to step on a nail.
Yeah.
I was that was in my mind the whole time.
I think 5 minutes before the that workshop started, I thought, when was my last tetanus shot?
I want to keep an eye on that.
Yeah.
So the bacteria is this pink that's right above your head, right?
Yeah. So this cloth here is mostly the bacteria, and there's a bit of rust on it as well. With some of the squares that we did, we also did multiple processes on it. So there's ones which have rust and bacteria and plant matter dye all together.
I'm really curious as to this square and this square that have the embroidery around a section that's dyed. How was that effect achieved?
Yeah, so with this square here, it was so along with having workshops that anyone could join, who, through the public invitations we did, I also said if anyone wanted to pick up base cloths and work at home on their own experimentations, they were welcome to. Because of the time period of when this was done, a lot of people were on holiday, but Abby Maxwell, who produced this piece, who's also doing their ND in fibers and queer grief studies here at Concordia, took a piece home and did some dyeing techniques of their own, and then restitched those parts of the dye onto the base cloth. And the other piece here is after doing embroidery threads, Jen Moisen, who's also our technician, then hand painted with a plant-based dye onto the cloth.
Okay. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to like the length of time of the collaboration and the slowness of the collaboration. Like slowness is an idea or a word that has been in a lot of conversations that I've been part of lately. This idea of research creation projects being allowed to take time and not being like workshop, 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 done, you know? What was your timeline and why did you choose such a time? For me, it seems like it was something that made the project what it was and made the project stronger. But can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I think, you know, we originally were thinking, we had a number, so Miranda Smitheram and I talked about, you know, what kind of project would we like to have? How would this engage our communities? And not only just textile materialities, but also like thinking about invitations across laboratories and milieu itself at large, the whole community. We decided on the summer just because we were there, and also it was a good time to pursue research projects which were outside the specific researches happening by research members, because often people go away for sabbatical or for summer break or whatever. So doing it across the summer made sense that way. It also was just kind of thought out as, let's produce workshops in August and have time after that to kind of reflect and to have a couple more sessions to kind of wrap up the project, to think through other parts of collaboration. I think the slowness, to answer that particular question, is how this will exist over time in a non-light fast environment. So we're going to display it after it comes down from this exhibition in our own cluster space. And over time, the dyes will shift. The colors of the serratia will also change and fade. And so at some future point, maybe it will get picked up again as a project to kind of either re-dye with or, you know, add more common cloth to. So, you know, it's an invitation for a futurity of it through the processes that kind of slowly decay the fabric itself.
And it'll be interesting. I remember in the rust dyeing workshop, we talked about the fact that pieces like this one, I think, right, which still have like rust in the actual fiber itself, will continue to decay and eventually will create this kind of lacy effect where the parts with the most rust on them will just rust away and start to disappear. So I guess that's part of the process that you'll see in time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think the rust will maybe have the most dramatic changes with the cloth. It's funny because I think after it goes through the process of washing, most of that will stop, but we don't really know until we see. So that part of the research is continuing into the future as we monitor a cloth or as we try to see what happens. So I mean, it would be interesting to see if someone wanted to try to make lace using rust, for example.
I know, that's where my mind goes. How can we make lace with rust?
Yeah. Well, are there any questions from the audience, maybe, or if there's anyone over Zoom? I don't know how long we've been talking also. It feels like hours and yet minutes.
Yeah, I don't know either.
We're good?
There are no questions on Zoom at the moment, but if there's anyone on Zoom who wants to contribute, you can type in the chat or you can unmute, turn your camera on. And for those of you in the space, do you have any questions?
Any questions?
It's not so much a question, but I was actually really fascinated to hear you talk about this sort of unwanted quality of the materials, in a sense, this bacteria, rust, and then even the gold, what's the plant matter that you used?
Goldenrod.
Which people are very allergic to or tend to be. So I found that really interesting to think of it more in that emotional context of these unwanted materials that you're working with. I mean, one can even, in some cases, think of embroidery in a sense that it's the repair of the damage and that kind of thing. So having been involved in the project on some level, it's not something that I had thought about. And so it's actually really interesting to hear that that come across. And I'm wondering if that was a consideration from the beginning or some that came out of it, or.
Yeah, so as I thank you, Mark. As I was saying right at the beginning, with this idea that the project is kind of metaphorically thinking about a physics garden, which also called a pharmacopoeia, as a kind of place of medicine or restitution, but at the same time existing within a wall. So we were also thinking perhaps about the boundaries that are created within our own systems of well-being or health or sanitization, or also the history, which is a broader topic than right now, but the history of kind of, Western science. So I think, within my ethos, I think a lot about the pleasure of ruins, the pleasure of decay, how these processes are, giving us opportunities to question what we have assumed as knowledge and ways of breaking down our knowledge, like literally letting the rust decay what we have built or thought of as an episteme. So I think there is an intention there, which I'm glad kind of perhaps got prompted or thought through within us talking. I don't know for you, Molly Claire, if that was something that you thought about while we were doing the project or on reflection now.
Well, when I think of rusty metal, I actually think of it as something that's really desirable, because when I was a teenager, I used to collect scrap metal and sell it, like, to make some spare money. And so when I think of rusty metal, I'm like, oh yeah, okay, I'm gonna go get that, pick it up, put it in the truck, So I think that maybe my relationship with like rust is a little bit different because of that context. But your question really struck me, because I was thinking about the idea of dyeing processes being really toxic, right? And I'm always interested in processes or like contexts in which our horrible ecological decisions are like put in our faces, and brought really close to us in a way that we see and understand and realize as being a thing that's real and exists. So the fact that the 3 dyeing processes were things that for various reasons are toxic to us or dangerous for us, whether we have allergies or whether we have a cut and don't have a tetanus shot, or, are washing our hands with soap and get this horrible bacteria on us. It's almost as if the reality of the toxicity of dyeing processes are like being put right in front of us in our faces in a way that maybe we don't see when we're thinking of a mass-produced garment that was dyed in a way that we just don't even understand, or even a garment that was dyed with RIT dye in our washing machine, But at the same time, these levels of toxicity are like human-sized levels of toxicity. We know how to deal with them. They're not actually toxic to our planet. Goldenrod is not toxic to the clump of bushes that goldenrod is growing in. It's toxic to us. Iron oxide is not toxic to the earth, it's toxic to us. So it's almost like this inversion of the toxicity of these processes, kind of like bringing it up, putting it in our faces, but also like reversing who we are being toxic to, if that makes sense, which is something that I hadn't thought of at all. But that comment made me think about that as maybe a thread through the whole project.
No, and just as an aside, I really agree with you and Mark about that. And I think one of the interesting things about goldenrod is also it's actually a plant which is very good at taking in toxins. So often it's, in a site which is being despoiled with industrial chemical processes, it's one of the first plants that can regrow there and also change the soil back towards being usable or no longer kind of, a sacrifice zone, which is often.
Oh, goldenrod. Wow. I have so much more appreciation for it now.
Yeah. Every time I sneeze now, I'm like, thank you, goldenrod.
You bless it instead of it blessing you.
Well, I think if that's it, that's all. Thank you everyone who joined us, and thank you Fourth Space.
Thank you, guys. We are going to go ahead now, I guess, and we're going to close up the Zoom and the live stream, but we thank you once again for joining us, both here in the space and online. And as a reminder, we have been live streaming this to YouTube, so it's available to revisit immediately after this. We will see you again tomorrow, starting, I believe, at 10 for more of the Commons. Thank you.